I really am very excited to talk tonight about Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And I wanted to thank, first off, Father for allowing me to do this evening. I want to also thank the staff of Holy Family Church. They've been very accommodating, the room, the facilities, and the printing job that was done for the prints that we made. I want to thank you for being here tonight as well. Thank you so much for being here. It's excellent to see your bright shining faces waiting to find out about the story of murder. It's awesome, really, to see. That was a joke. There are printouts, so there were printouts. I only could make 10, just so you know. And if you didn't get one, I'm sorry, perhaps we can make more later, or I can give you the readings later. I figured it was easier that way than to attempt something of printing the whole book, or referring to the book piece by piece. Okay. I was playing the Russian music in the background, but I don't think I will because of that exactly. Thank you. So, yeah, it's cropping up somewhere. So, my name is William Lassiter, for those of you who have not met me before. And I've been a teacher for 25 plus years, English literature, history, as well as a little smattering of Latin. I do want to start off with a little bit of caveat here, a little caveat for the giving of a lecture on crime and punishment. First off, I'm not a scholar of Dostoevsky, scholar in air quotes. I'm not a scholar. I don't read Russian, okay? I don't know Russian history as well as I ought. It's sketchy. And I've only read Crime and Punishment 4 or 5 times, so it's not like I've read it extensively backwards and forwards. So if, for instance, I get things wrong, if you are a Russian scholar and I pronounce something wrong, if you know your Russian history better than I do and say, no, that's Nicholas I and not Nicholas II, please, je m'excuse. I beg your pardon in advance, and know that I'm only here to try and offer something good rather than be an academic type. The other problem here I want to give as a caveat is that time being what it is, we can only cover so much. And the immensity of this work is truly phenomenal, as most Russian literature pieces are. Russian literature is kind of like one of those great, vast openings of a Russian forest. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And this one, like the Brothers K, is quite voluminous. So I won't be able to give an entire scope of the work, and I won't be able to give a summary of the work. In fact, when I was asked the task of summarizing this body of work, I was reminded of the Monty Python skit of summarizing Marcel Proust. It felt a little bit daunting to me. If you've seen the skit, hopefully you know what I'm talking about. Father presented this challenge to me, and I felt like quoting Exodus and saying, "Pardon your servant, Lord, please send someone else." I didn't do that. Someone once said that summarizing Dostoevsky is a bit like wrestling a polar bear into a bikini. You might succeed in dressing the bear, but you won't survive the experience. So, and that brings me to my first slide. So there we go. The immensity of this work is truly amazing. And what I would like to do here is I'd like to say that there are many reasons to love Dostoevsky, and I'll gloss over those really quickly. But I hope in this presentation to give a taste of Dostoevsky if you've not had some insight into the work if you have read him before, and perhaps a critique of his understanding, not in a negative way, but a critique as it's topical, set in the current year. A young student of lower middle class origin who has been expelled from the university and who lives in dire poverty succumbs through thoughtlessness and lack of strong convictions to certain strange, incomplete ideas that are floating in the air, and decides to get out of his misery once and for all. I'm going to take this statement of Dostoevsky's about thoughtlessness and lack of strong conviction, leading to a certain strange, or being influenced by certain strange, incomplete ideas floating in the air, that leads the main character to decide to get out of his misery once and for all. I'm going to take that as our model, as our skeleton. Because I think what Dostoevsky is saying here really embodies the very nature of the work. This is in 1865 that he wrote this letter. And the work is published in 1866, just for the record. I'll begin with a little bit of history. And I know some people find history to be somewhat on the tedious. I find it exciting as anything, because we see with history the elements that lead to our own world and all the crackling events that occur therein. Okay? So, first off, in Russian history, we have a matrix of events that are occurring, because Russia is very closely tied to Europe. So we have to keep in mind what's happening in Europe and happening in the rest of the world when we're looking at Russian history. Tsar Nicholas I is Tsar up until 1855. He's like the emperor or like the king. Dostoevsky himself was born in 1821, and he lives to 1881. So he's living through almost the majority of the 19th century. He is a 19th century man through and through. The Decembrist revolt occurs in 1825. This is a revolt against Nicholas I, major event in Russian imagination, because it was a moment when the army fought against the army. The army that supported Nicholas fought against the army that was against him and his reforms. And there was a huge battle that occurred at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and that was in 1825, where the Decembrists, as they were called, were wiped out by the army. So this is a major event that sticks in the mind of Russians, at least 19th century Russians. 1848 was a year of generally unrest in Europe, but particularly unrest in Germany. We have to keep in mind that in 1848, after this unrest in Germany, one character who was organizing that unrest got kicked out and was exiled to England. His name was Karl Marx. And he published the Communist Manifesto in late 1848. So this year here, the 1825 Decembrist Revolt, a year of violence and revolt, is connected in some ways to that revolt in Germany in 1848 and the publishing of the Communist Manifesto. So just keeping that in mind. In 1855, Tsar Alexander II comes to the throne of Russia. I'm sorry about the black, it doesn't show up as well here. Apologize for that. 1855, he becomes the Tsar. And Alexander II is the Tsar when Dostoevsky is publishing this novel in 1866. 1853 to 56, you have the Crimean War. That is a war with Great Britain over this peninsula there in, is it the Black Sea? I think the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. This is a major battle of great carnage on both sides. So we have carnage, we have revolution. We have in 1861 the Emancipation Reform, which freed the serfs in Russia. So up till 1861, you had serfs, slaves, essentially. All the peasants were slavish. They couldn't move, they couldn't own land, they couldn't hold government positions. They were basically treated like cattle by these the men who controlled them, essentially. So the Emancipation Reform of 1861 freed the serfs. That's 5 years before the novel is published, so just so we keep that in mind. 1865, in America, we have the end of the American Civil War. So we were going through a period of turmoil as well. And in 1866, Dostoevsky publishes Crime and Punishment in serial form, that is in magazine form. So this is the historical matrix in which Dostoevsky is thinking and operating and ultimately publishing his work, just to keep in mind what we're going to be seeing here in a minute. So a long list of peoples, because there are lots of folks in the 19th century that are worth considering. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of them, but as early as the late 19th century, as early as the late 18th century, William Blake is writing his great poetry that shook the nation of England. William Wordsworth, Edgar Allan Poe, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne are all writing in America. So these are tremendously powerful writers and thinkers at the time that Dostoevsky is also writing. In England, we have Charles Dickens. Again, in America, Ralph Waldo Emerson. We have one character named Charles Darwin who publishes this really important work called The All-New Origin of Species, 1859. So you'll see right there how in relation to the publication of this work was Darwin's work. And that work had tremendous impact on the entire thought sphere of Europe. Karl Marx, as I said before, publishes Communist Manifesto in 1848. We had in America Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, who are publishing works that are expressing similar themes to Dostoevsky. And then we have this character with the magnificent mustachios on the left. His name is Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Which, by the way, if you ever have to write on Nietzsche, cut and paste, because his name is a deuce to try and spell every single time. So Nietzsche is famous for the aphorism, God is dead. And perhaps you've heard that already, God is dead, Nietzsche is dead, God, the t-shirt that says that. Nietzsche is famous for publishing the aphorism, God is dead. He's famous for publishing the concept of the ubermensch, the Superman. He's famous for publishing the concept of the last man as well. Those works, those concepts were all published in one major work called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, also sprach Zarathustra. And that was published in 1885. And for music buffs out there, Richard Strauss composed a tone poem based on it in 1896. Fantastic piece of work. Now, in this last figure, that is Nietzsche, we get an idea which really taints Dostoevsky and the 19th century, okay? And this last figure is the one that we're immediately drawn to when we read Crime and Punishment. Most people think that Crime and Punishment is a response to Nietzsche. I mean, for instance, in the work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche presents the idea of the ubermensch. And the ubermensch is generally conceived of as a perfect specimen of man, physically, mentally, and spiritually, capable of transcending the law that is created. He is exonerated of all transgressions because he attempts great things, and he's able to remake the world and extend mankind into perpetuity. He is therefore destined to rule over lesser beings. And I put this picture up here. Anybody know what this is? What is this?
The Nazi rallies.
This is the Nazi rallies in Nuremberg, right, in the 30s. The Nazi Party is, in many ways, based on this very idea of the Ubermensch. They were the Ubermenschen. Okay? They were the master race. That's what they called themselves. So for us, it seems as though Crime and Punishment is an attempt to refute this idea. Raskolnikov himself seems to be someone who's proving himself different from the last man and fulfilling the role of the Superman. His punishment, suffering, and eventual redemption seem to be the refutation of Nietzsche's ideas. However, this interpretation is actually a perversion by Nietzsche's sister. So this perversion of Nietzsche's ideas is done by his sister, Therese Elisabeth Alexander Förster Nietzsche. She was an ardent German nationalist and an anti-Semite who used her brother's work after his mental collapse to prop up the master race theory of German superiority. So it was his sister, right, Therese Elisabeth, who took these ideas that were presented in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and twisted them, took them out of context, perverted them, and used them to support the idea of the National Socialist Party in Germany in the 1930s. So we have to keep that in mind, that really Dostoevsky would not be refuting somebody who was agreeing with him. Okay? So if we see that Nietzsche might be agreeing with him, he's not refuting Nietzsche. More to the point, though, the publication date of Crime and Punishment is 1866. The publication date of Zarathustra is 1885. That's almost a 20-year difference between the two, with this being the later work. So really, in conclusion here, it is impossible that Dostoevsky is responding to Nietzsche's thought. So it's not possible. Sir?
Is that the first, Zarathustra, is that the first time we talked about the Ubermensch?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's the first time that it's talked about in that language. Good question. As I'll show you, it's been around for longer than that. Okay. So there's no way that Dostoevsky could have been responding to Nietzsche. And anytime anybody says, they say, well, whoa, wait a minute. 19 years is a big gap. Okay. So if that's the case, what is he talking about, if not this response to Nietzsche? Well, in order to tackle this big idea of what is he talking about, I want to take us back a little bit of basic literary interpretation here, to understand there are 4 levels to understand a work of art. They are the literal, the allegorical, the moral, or propological, and the anagogical. Okay? Literal means the words that are actually on the page, the actions the characters are saying. Allegorical means how it's connected to other things, historical and literary, and sometimes within the work itself. Moral or tropological is, what is the message for humanity as a whole? And finally, anagogical, what is the message for me personally as a reader? So whenever we read a work of art, we have to think about it on all four levels, almost simultaneously. We can academically break it down into separate levels and look at each one individually before we put a piece back into the work. That's just in order to get that out of the way here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at some basics on the literal level of the work, just to get the feet wet into the work itself. The work is written in serial form, published in 1866 by Fyodor Dostoevsky in Russia. The setting of the novel is a very hot summer in St. Petersburg. Very hot, kind of like yesterday. Okay? And that has bearing on the work, by the way, just so you know. Okay, it has bearing on the work. But the opening of the novel is on an exceptionally hot evening early in July. A young man came out of the garret in which he lodged in S Place and walked slowly, as though in hesitation, towards Cambridge. How many of you, just a poll here, how many of you are familiar already with this phrase because you've read the work once? Just want to check. Okay, good. Okay, so some people, this is brand new to you, all right? This is the opening of the work. It's a very hot summer. One of the immediate draws you could say about it being a very hot summer, it's kind of like hell. You know, if you were outside at all yesterday, it's kind of like hell. And that's important for the work because we're going to be looking at something here which is kind of like hell. All right. The setting of the work itself is in Tsarist Russia. It is in St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is an interesting place to have a setting because, first off, it's an Enlightenment city it's an Enlightenment city that's built like Washington, D.C. on a swamp. Both St. Petersburg and Washington, D.C. were built on a swamp, intentionally so. Washington, D.C. partly because it was halfway between the northern and the southern states, but mostly it was built on that because they wanted to prove that Enlightenment ideas could conquer even the worst terrain on the face of the planet, right? Little known fact about Washington, D.C. actually. If you go to Washington, D.C., it's still a swamp. In more ways than one, right? So St. Petersburg was built in a similar way because the Enlightenment idea said that reason can conquer everything, even the human spirit, which is kind of like a swamp. It can be conquered, it can be chartered, it can be laid out and fixed. So St. Petersburg, to a great degree, is a representation of the Enlightenment project to fix mankind. Right, that being said, this is the second largest city in Russia. The first is Moscow, so big city. It's on the Neva River, the Gulf of Finland, the Baltic Sea, and for those of you who are geography buffs, this meant that Russia had access to the Baltic and then the North Sea and then to the Atlantic, and it could contend with Britain there in the north by launching ships from St. Petersburg. So that's a major, major, major bonus for the Russian Empire. So that's another reason why they built it there. It was founded in 1703 by Peter the Great. Okay. And this city got really swollen with people after the liberation of the serfs in 1861. So rural citizens, who were before they could not move around and they're mostly farmers, they all flocked to the city after they were freed looking for jobs. That meant the city was jam-packed with people, and the infrastructure failed, and it was overcrowded, and it smelled bad, and the sewer systems broke down, and it was just a mess. So St. Petersburg, which is supposed to be this beautiful city, really was pretty heinous at the time that Dostoevsky was writing. Just so we keep that in mind too for the setting of the city. Also later on, this is the site of the Winter Palace, where the Tsars had their winter home, and it's where the Red Army stormed the Winter Palace during the Bolshevik Revolution, just so you know. Characters in the novel then. Okay. We have, and these are not the characters, by the way, these are just great Russian paintings. I thought it's so cool. Rodion Romanich Raskolnikov. That's our protagonist. That's the main character. Okay? His name, all the names mean something, but this one particularly bears a little bit of focus. Rodion is a form of Herodias, Herod, as in Herod the baby killer. And the name itself comes from Greek, Heros Oidos, which means the song of the hero. So Raskolnikov is literally our hero in the story. He is Rodion, the hero. Romanich means son of Rome. Raskolnikov derives from the Russian Raskolnik, which means schismatic. So he is a schismatic. He's broken away from whatever the authorities are. His mother is Pulcheria Alexandrovna Raskolnikov. Pulcheria means beautiful, I think, in Latin. Sister of Raskolnikov is Avdotia Romanovna Raskolnikov, referred to as Dunya. Then you have Dmitry Prokofyevich Razumikin, who's a friend of Raskolnikov. Great picture there, really fits Razumikin. Next you have Semyon Zakharovich Marmeladov. Marmeladov is a drunken, unemployed city official. His daughter here, Sonia Semyonovna Marmeladov. She's the daughter of Semyon. She's a prostitute. She prostituted herself in order just to survive and be able to not starve to death. She ends up being the love interest of Raskolnikov. Then you have Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, one of my favorite villains in literature, Svidrigailov. He's an elegant sensualist who tries to seduce Dunya. He's not successful, but it's pretty dicey. And finally, or almost finally, you have Fyodor Petrovich Luzhin. He's the fiancé of Dunya. Okay? And he's a piece of work. If you read the work, he's what the English call, I think, a prig is the word. He's very full of himself, and he thinks everybody should worship him. He's a man of the modern man. Keep that picture in your head too, because I made a little joke here. The next and last one I'll go over is Porfiry Petrovich. His name basically means son of Peter, and Porfiry means purple. So he's purple son of Peter. He's the chief of police, and he hunts down Raskolnikov. But as my daughter pointed out, he does it in a remarkably gentle way. I was real struck by this time around. He's very gentle in the way he hunts down Raskolnikov. He's not chasing him through the sewers of provincial towns. You know, he actually comes to him and says, "Oh, I know you did it. And I'm waiting for you. Anytime you want to come tell me you did it, because you will eventually come tell me." Which is like the soft sell for police work. All right, so Porfiry Petrovich. Okay, the basic plot of the work, and here's where I'm wrestling the polar bear, and I thought I'd just go and just say that this is it. The polar bear is this. The basic plot: a young student living in poverty kills a wicked old pawnbroker and her sister. It's a crime. Prompted by Sonia Marmeladov and hounded by Porfiry Petrovich, Raskolnikov suffers a punishment and eventually confesses the crime, being sentenced to hard labor in Siberia. The end. I thought that was pretty good, a two-part wrestling of the polar bear. But it's really, you can summarize the work by crime and punishment. But the remarkable thing is it's not, unlike most novels, it's not who did it. When's the crime going to happen? Oh, here it comes. Dang, it was awful. The end. It's not like that. Nor is it the crime. Who did it? Who did it? We wonder who did it. Let's find out. It's not like that either. It's we know who did it. He's going to do it for sure, even from the beginning. He does it, and then for the next 500 pages, he's punished. So it's really like crime and punishment, 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 punishment. So that leads us to what are we talking about with the meaning of the work? What's the allegorical and the tropological and the anagogical meaning that we're trying to get at here? So using this as using Dostoevsky's own words as a model for where our thought can go, I want to start first with what he said about thoughtlessness and lack of strong convictions. He said that Raskolnikov, the protagonist, is influenced by certain things because of his own thoughtlessness and lack of strong convictions. And what does he mean here? What he's talking about the nature of modern man in the 19th century. The nature of modern man in the 19th century. And though he published after Dostoevsky, I think Friedrich Nietzsche gives some insight into this modern man idea. These certain strange, incomplete ideas floating in the air that influence men that are thoughtless and lack strong conviction. So the first thing I'd like to do, I gave you a handout. If you don't have a handout with you, I'm sorry, I'm just going to truncate my reading. But the first reading is actually from Zarathustra. And I'm only going to read a portion of this so you get a sense of it. And you can read more of it later. Okay. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduces the idea of the Superman, or ubermensch, thus shifting the focus of life away from the divine ideal of Christianity to a man-made ideal for human perfection. But here's the ticket. He's not doing it to say Christianity is bunk and we shouldn't worship Christ at all. What he's saying is that the current form of Christianity is bankrupt. It's empty. It doesn't have meaning or impact for us anymore, and we need to rethink what we're doing. And that's what Nietzsche was trying to do, rethink what we're doing. So he proposes, instead of a Christ, he proposes his idea of the ubermensch, the superman, which is not something which we attain to by beefing ourselves up and getting mentally smart. It's something that we have as an ideal that then allows us to achieve greatness because we're aiming for something greater than just animal existence. Let me read you, and read along if you have the copy here. It says, this is from Zarathustra. When Zarathustra was alone, however, he said to his heart, could it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard of it, that God is dead. So the first thing in Zarathustra we have to notice is that this character Zarathustra, Zoroaster by the way, has met a hermit in the forest, and the hermit doesn't yet hear the news. And it's big news that Zarathustra's come across. God is dead. Meaning that society, by its nature, has killed the idea of God in its heart. It's put God into a box. And God no longer terrifies or inspires or motivates or enthuses anyone anymore. People are so comfortable, they're so full of themselves, they think they're on the way to progress, they don't need God. So God is essentially dead. And for Nietzsche, for Zoroaster, Zarathustra, that's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing, okay? So it's not that God is dead, it's God is dead, and we are suffering because of it, okay? So that's the first thing to note here, right? He goes on to say, well, what do we replace it with? We replace it with this, he says. When Zarathustra arrived at the nearest town, which adjoins the forest, he found many people assembled in the marketplace, for it had been announced that a rope dancer would give a performance. And Zarathustra spoke thus unto the people, I teach you the Superman. Man is something that is to be surpassed. What have you done to surpass man? Okay? And he goes on to say, I teach you the Superman. He is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say, the Superman shall be the meaning of the earth. I conjure you, my brethren, remain true to the earth, and believe not those who speak unto you of super-earthly hosts. Poisoners are they, whether they know it or not. Despisers of life are they, decaying ones and poisoned ones themselves, of whom the earth is weary. So away with them. And then skipping a bit, it says, midway down in the next page. Lo, I teach you the Superman. One must be a sea to receive a polluted stream without becoming impure. Lo, I teach you the Superman. He is that sea. In him can your great contempt be submerged. Right? What is the greatest thing you can experience? It's the hour of great contempt. The hour in which even your happiness becomes loathsome unto you, and so also your reason and virtue. And he goes on to talk about these loathsome things. It's almost like Ecclesiastes. He says, have you ever spoken thus to yourself? Have you ever cried thus? Ah, would that I had heard you crying thus. It is not your sin, it is your self-satisfaction that cries unto heaven. Your very sparingness in sin cries unto heaven. Where is the lightning to lick you with its tongue? Where is the frenzy with which you should be inoculated? Lo, I teach you the Superman. He is that lightning. He is that frenzy. And then he goes on further on to say about the Superman. Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman. A rope over an abyss. Man is a rope, right, between Superman and the animal. It's a rope stretched over an abyss. And finally, at the end of that quotation, that big long quotation, he goes into almost a Beatitudes here. I love him who does this. He says, Lo, I am a herald of the lightning, and a heavy drop out of the cloud. The lightning, however, is the Superman. So the first thing to glean from this quotation that we're seeing here in Zarathustra, is that this idea of Superman is a response to something. It's a response to a deadness of soul that Nietzsche was seeing already in European cultures, late 19th century. And in this same work, he presents the concept of what's called the last man. This is the corruption that he has seen, is the last man. And for Nietzsche, the last man is an abomination. This figure, he says, asks the question, what is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? And then he blinks in stupefaction, like, who asked those questions? I don't ask those questions. The last man is himself somebody who is a contrast to the Superman. And he says, this is the kind of guy that we're seeing around us everywhere, is the last man. So he says, and this is again the quotation, right? There cometh the time when man will no longer give birth to any star, alas. There comes the time of the most despicable man who can no longer despise himself. They have their little pleasures for the day and their little pleasures for the night, but they have a regard for health, so never too much. You know, have a little bit of naughtiness here and a little naughtiness there, but don't be too risque. Just be healthy, because health is all that there is, right? What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asks the last man and blinks at it. Right? I don't know what those are. Why do you ask those questions? For the last man, a little poison now and then makes pleasant dreams, and much poison at last for a pleasant death. So he's kind of, the last one is kind of like stupefied the whole time. He's a man who's drugged with morphine, drugged with alcohol, drugged with meth, drugged with the internet, drugged with video games, drugged with movies, drugged with music, drugged with politics. He's drugged constantly. And that the last man for Nietzsche is a man who is so drugged that he doesn't ask any important questions anymore. Consequently, he says, formerly all the world was insane, say the subtlest of them, and they blink their eyes. So everybody before us was insane. We know what we're doing, though. We have discovered happiness, yay. And it's the meta-universe, yay. It's happiness. Disney, yay. And finally, the earth, Nietzsche says, has then become small, and on it there hops the last man who makes everything small. So this is the sickness that Nietzsche was seeing in the late 19th century. See, he held that man was more than a commercial being. Man was more than a commercial being. More than just a cog in a Kafkian machine. Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss. I contend that both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche seem to have been responding to another earlier thinker who proposed an earlier version of the Superman, a figure of swollen ego based on reason. This guy, this man here writing before Dostoevsky actually is proposing what Nietzsche responds to in The Last Man, and what Dostoevsky responds to in the character of Luzhin. This is Nikolai Chernyshevsky. And in her article, Floating in the Air, The World That Made Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Jennifer Wilson writes, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, whose novel of ideas, What Is to Be Done, modeled a philosophy that would later be described as rational egoism, relied on the idea that human beings, guided by enlightened self-interest, would ultimately choose to live in a fair and equal society. Dostoevsky, on the other hand, could not abide this scientific dissection of desire, believing that people were ultimately unaware of why they wanted the things they wanted. He knew human beings to be irrational, profoundly self-destructive. He saw these tendencies in his own propensity for gambling, procrastination, and daily forms of self-ruin. Dostoevsky was especially appalled by Chernyshevsky's claim that actions taken in pursuit of a better society were themselves necessarily good. He saw in this seemingly innocent theory a potential justification for violence. In other words, this negative idea of the ubermensch was already infecting European society. This guy, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, let me just look at him, you can just tell. This guy was proposing, on the one hand, that our ego, when it's driven by pure reason and guided by self-interest, would inevitably choose what was right. You just propose it to the person who's been well-trained, well-indoctrinated, well-educated, and they'll choose to recycle. You know? They'll choose to do what they're told to do. It's obvious. Moreover, that if you have a great man who's doing some tremendous action, he can wade through a field of blood, and it's okay. Corpses can pile up around a guy like that because he knows what he's doing, and he's doing something tremendous, like Napoleon, for society. That's Chernyshevsky. And Chernyshevsky himself, to some degree, is embodying a thought matrix that was already enveloping Europe as early as the late 19th century. See, as early as the late 1700s, we're already seeing elements of this that are objected to by poets like William Blake. Okay? William Blake is writing in 1794 here. And he is already warning us against such monsters of ego and the grinding machine of society in what he called dark satanic mills. He was crying out against the pitiless society that ignored the downtrodden chimney sweeps and beggars of society. He was prophesying against the numbness of culture he perceived as cold and merciless. He, like other poets and artists, was crying against what they perceived to be a world increasingly unmoored from meaning or purpose. It was a world where a certain type of man, human, was being cultivated. A person who justified all their actions because they're doing the Lord's work. Who justified all they did because this was in the name of reason, in the name of science. That even the Church of England, for instance, in Blake's world, even the Church of England was the way God intended. It was the best of all possible worlds, so to speak. And the Church of England, in Blake's time, was sanctifying the roles of the chimney sweep should be where he is, and the banker should be where he is, and never the twain should meet, because that's God's will. Blake, his gorge rose at that. He got nauseous at that idea. And he wrote here in a divine image, cruelty has a human heart, jealousy a human face, terror the human form divine, and secrecy the human dress. The human dress is forged iron, the human form a fiery forge, the human face a furnace sealed, the human heart its hungry gorge. In other words, cruelty and jealousy, that's a human trait. We all have a propensity towards it. Terror is done by humans to humans. It's not God's will that we go terrorize people. We do it because we're human and we are capable of this tremendous terror. And we're secretive and furtive, not because that's God's will, but because that's what we are, and it's terrifying. But we're also forged iron. We are as strong as iron. Our faces are like fire. They blaze like with light. Our form itself is a fiery forge. And the heart itself is a heart that cannot be filled up. It's a hungry gorge, Blake says. This idea also is echoed by William Wordsworth in his poem, The World is Too Much With Us. This is written in 1802, just to give you an idea of how early this idea is beginning to appear on the scene. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears our bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleepy flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I stand on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sighted Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. To put it another way, modern man is so filled with commerce and trade that he has no sensitivity at all to what's really real anymore. And he, Wordsworth, would rather be, well, he isn't, he's a Christian, he would rather be a pagan, because at least there he might feel something. That's the numbness that Nietzsche talks about in the late 19th century. It's the numbness that Dostoevsky talks about in his main character, Raskolnikov. And though it would be a stretch to say that Raskolnikov is committing the crime to put meaning back into his life, Dostoevsky's prophetic voice seems to have foretold something that was just on the horizon in Western culture there in mid-19th century. There was a crisis of meaning in Western culture. A crisis so severe that by the 20th century, we get the philosopher Albert Camus, who posed us what's called the greatest existential problem in philosophy. Camus says there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Whether to kill yourself. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer the question, says Camus. Which is pretty powerful stuff at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, he's looking back at that 100 years past and the dullness that he saw on the landscape, and he's saying, this is what we've come to. That meaning has been so stripped from Western culture that we're asking this question, why bother with anything anymore? A question which, by the way, if you read Crime and Punishment, shows up again and again and again, right? How many characters in Dostoevsky novels here or elsewhere try to commit suicide? How many characters try to jump off a bridge, right, or whatever? It's because his novels are dealing with the very same emptiness that Camus is seeing there in the early 20th century. Dostoevsky then embodies this in his passages, and I first want to tend to Romano Guardini here, but he embodies it in one scene particularly where a woman jumps off a bridge and Raskolnikov sees her, and here's just a little snippet of that passage. This is in part 2, chapter 6. The woman was looking straight at Raskolnikov, but obviously she saw nothing and recognized no one. Suddenly she leaned her right hand on the parapet, lifted her right leg over the railing, and then her left, and threw herself into the canal. He turned his back to the railing and looked about him. Very well then, he said resolutely. And he moved from the bridge and walked in the direction of the police office. His heart felt hollow and empty. He did not want to think. Even his depression had passed. There was not a trace now of the energy with which he had set out to make an end of it all. Complete apathy had succeeded to it. He just saw a woman kill herself. And Raskolnikov was like, stuff happens. Her suicide is a despairing act due to meaninglessness, but Raskolnikov's response is also one devoid of meaning. Why did she kill herself? What difference does it make? What does anything make as a difference? See, that kind of question he's not asking. And it's problematic, very problematic. This crisis of meaning seems to have been the major problem already plaguing 19th century Europe, as early as the time of the Enlightenment, probably. In 1956, after 2 cataclysmic world wars, and in the midst of the Cold War, this guy here, Romano Guardini, which, by the way, if you haven't read him, is fantastic, The End of the Modern World, I highly recommend it. Romano Guardini writes that mass man, as he calls him, has no desire for independence or originality in either the management or the conduct of his life. The gadgets and techniques forced upon him by the patterns of machine production and of abstract planning, mass man accepts quite simply. They are the forms of life itself. Right, so a new iPhone, yeah, that's great, that's coming out. I'll accept that. To either a greater or lesser degree, mass man is convinced that his conformity is both reasonable and just. Similarly, the new man of the masses has no desire to live his life according to principles which are uniquely his own. Neither liberty of external action nor freedom of internal judgment seem for him to have unique value, and understandably so, he's never experienced them. As a simple matter of course, mass man unites himself with an organization modeled after the mass itself. There he obeys whatever program is placed before him, so he follows this flag and the next flag, and this cause, and this new thing. In this fashion, the man without personality finds himself placed on the one road which will assuredly carry him through life. Of even more significance, the regimented instincts of this new human type forbid him to appear distinctive, compel him to appear anonymous. It's like on the internet, huh? Anonymous. Mass man acts almost as if he felt that to be oneself was both the source of all injustice and even a sign of peril. To be oneself was both the source of all injustice and even a sign of peril. How can you be yourself, right, in the modern era, when you don't know yourself? And how can you know yourself unless you ask certain questions? But to ask those questions is terrifying. And so mass man, modern man, the last man, doesn't ask those questions. See? Kind of a circular problem there. Mass man, like Nietzsche's last man, is a figure of the modern world. This is the type of person that we're dealing with here that Dostoevsky is saying he wants to write about. He chases the current truth, willingly places his own freedom under the jackboot of authority, submits his ideas to process, is satisfied with material goods, never asks questions, never feels strong emotion or passion, and is always a believer in the progress of mankind through reason and science. He is a man of the same sort of regimented instincts that William Blake railed against back at the end of the 18th century in Songs of Innocence and Experience. And if you know somebody like this, you better help them, right? Because this is a bad state to be in. It's kind of like being Lazarus. It's kind of like being dead. Mass man or last man or this regimented man is like Lazarus because he's not really alive. He's not fully human. And by the way, the reference to Lazarus, remember in the book, what does Raskolnikov read with Sonia? Right? The passage of Lazarus. Okay. William Blake wrote in London, the poem London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldiers sigh, runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. See, for Blake, it wasn't just a question of emptiness. It was emptiness that used other human beings as well. And so how does the harlot get sick? Well, technically she has syphilis in the poem. And she spreads the syphilis not just to people of her own class, but to people of the upper classes who never ask the question of whether visiting a harlot is the right thing to do. They never ask the question of whether the harlot's a human. They never ask the question of whether or not this is going to affect their own family. And Blake says, guess what? Your children are going to have this disease. Your children will die, and you will not be able to have children. And therefore, your entire progeny is going to be cut off. And if this is on a mass scale, that's the whole human race, friends. That's what Blake is saying. It's no accident, I think, that Dostoevsky has as his main love interest Sonia, who is a harlot. Right? She is prostituting herself. That's not an accident. I think he's thinking about the same thing that is going on here in William Blake when he talks about the chartered man. I apologize for the heat, by the way. It's like a long, hot summer in July in St. Petersburg. Chartered man, like the last man or mass man, is a name just for the problem that was happening in the 19th century, and we could say the 20th and 21st. Chartered man refuses the burden of life, the suffering of living. He seeks a God in the material comfort of the world. He abdicates his responsibility to ask questions, to care for others, to shoulder the weight of existence. And thus, he infects himself and future generations with a plague, in this case syphilis, which threatens his own extinction. Sir?
What does chartered mean? In chartered street, chartered Thames, chartered...
Yeah, it means mapped out or controlled, either one. So in this case, the chartered Thames, by this point, the Thames was originally just a free-flowing river. But by the time he's writing, the Thames had been concreted up so that it didn't flood anymore, and it flowed exactly where the planners wanted it to go, in theory. It didn't really, it still flooded. But it flowed exactly where the planners wanted it to go. So it was controlled. The life-giving energy of water flowed that way. And oddly enough, I think it was during his time, maybe a little later, with the advent of certain new technologies that were going to make everything great, namely the flush toilet, the Thames became the repository of human waste. And all that chartering of the river, it actually caused ordure to build up in the river so much that it stopped flowing. And it sat stagnant. And you can imagine, this is probably, it was 1870s, 1880s. In the 1880s, July, hot summer, a stagnant river Thames filled with human ordure. Boy! Imagine that. It sort of like as a backfire on the planners that wanted to charter the Thames. And I think Parliament actually had to cancel Parliament because it was so bad. So it's almost like they invented something fantastic that was going to be progressive, and it ended up doing exactly the opposite of what they wanted. Yes, sir.
I just had maybe more of a comment than a question. In law, the term charter chartered was the precursor to the corporation.
Yes, sir.
And as a backdrop to all of the philosophers that you've cited and the priest that you cite at the very end talking about mass man is the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
And that was fertile ground for those 19th century philosophers and Marx and then Darwin.
Yep.
All of this must have had, I know Dostoevsky didn't live, it sounds like he didn't live to see the 20th century.
No.
But it just seems that within that soup, that turmoil, he must have known or understood what was happening with what was about to come in terms of revolution and Marxism and really the disillusionment of man, I think.
Yes, I think you're latching onto the theme I'm trying to get across here. So good, because that's exactly what I'm contending here, is that Dostoevsky was a prophet because he was seeing what was already happening. What would later culminate in the trenches there in the Somme or in the bomb there at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was seeing a spiritual malaise or malady that was already infecting Europe, and it was causing some really bad stuff to occur. Okay, and no, he didn't live to see Nietzsche or Darwin, but he did live to see Marx. I mean, he's constantly commenting on the Communist Manifesto and Marxism in his works. He did live to see he lived through or was alive during the Decembrist Revolution, and he comments on something which I'll get to in just a minute, which is the actual schism in the Russian church, which is a big deal for Russians. I was quite surprised at how big this is. I didn't know this at all, but I'm American, so I don't know anything. The joke Mark Twain makes, war is nature's way of teaching Americans geography. So true. So this fellow here, Alan Watts, and people have various opinions on him, but he does say some very good things every now and then. And one of the things he pointed out in a speech about materialism is that we don't, in modern era, we don't actually love material. Materialism doesn't mean we love material. In fact, he says we hate it. We are devoted to the cause of converting it as fast as possible into junk and poisoned gas. We are not people who love time, which is one of the measurements of material, and space, which is another. We want to abolish it. So I think it's very prescient on Watts' part. I think this was happening as early as the Enlightenment, as you pointed out. Abolish those horrible things, time and space. Get rid of them because, gosh, it's such a pain. Wouldn't it be better if we could, leap across the world very, very quickly, right? Or if we weren't even embodied in space at all, but our consciousness was somehow uploaded to some magnificent machine of some kind. Wouldn't that be great? That'd be awesome. I think Alan Watts is very prescient here. We don't love material. The modern man does not love material. He's a type that hates it and wants to regulate it or charter it. Modern man has lost the vision, as I say, of the divine. And he no longer sees the created world, the material world, as charged with the grandeur of God, as Hopkins wrote. In fact, he despises the material world and sees it as a hateful, contemptible prison to be bent to his will. Like Nietzsche's last man, this chartered soul of the mass man blinks at any questions that provoke thought, introspection, or compassion toward others. Dostoevsky seems to have been particularly incensed by such complacent dullness of spirit. So, for instance, he has a man, one of his characters, Monolodov, who asks a man who lives in his building, a young intellectual committed to the latest ideas, named Lebeziatnikov. He asks him for a loan, please, because he's dying of poverty, basically. Everything he gets, he squanders on alcohol. He can't control his alcoholism. So he's asking for a loan. And Lebeziatnikov coldly refuses him with the explanation from his neighbor that, quote, in our era, compassion has even been prohibited by science, and that this is already being done in England, where they've developed political economy. Mass man, or last man, is a man who no longer asks questions about meaning, yet is himself utterly devoid of meaning and purpose. Human life, Dostoevsky seems to insist, requires shouldering the burden of existence, loving others, and therefore losing others, recognizing our own need for forgiveness, and asking the most profound questions. What is life? Who is God? Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? How long have I got? What is man that you should care for him, mortal man, that you should come to him? The modern man avoids those questions. He ceases, therefore, to be human at all. He is very much the character of Lucian. Oops. It's not my thing. He's very much the character of Lucian. Okay? And Lucian ceases to be human himself and tries to control others instead. He seeks to raise a poor girl out of the dust and make her worship him. And I think this is in your quotation packet if you want to follow along. It says, yet Lucian, after he's been rejected by Dunya, he still thought highly of his own resolution in lifting Dunya to his level and regarded it as something heroic. And speaking of it to Dunya, he had let out the secret feeling he cherished and admired, and he could not understand that others should fail to admire it too. He had called on Raskolnikov with the feelings of a benefactor who was about to reap the fruits of his good deeds and to hear agreeable flattery. And as he went downstairs now, he considered himself most undeservedly uninjured and unrecognized. Dunya was simply essential to him. To do without her was unthinkable. For many years he had had voluptuous dreams of marriage, but he had gone on waiting and amassing money. He brooded with relish and profound secret over the image of a girl. Virtuous, poor, she must be poor, very young, very pretty, of good birth and education, very timid, one who had suffered much and was completely humbled before him, one who all her life looked on him as her savior, worship him, admire him, and only him. Doesn't that just give you the creeps right there? I don't think that's a good quotation yet. You read this kind of character, it's like a guy who has these fantasies about, I don't know, we would run to see some kind of like animated girlfriend, It's like that's what he's thinking about, I want some virtual girlfriend. I don't want a real flesh and blood human. I want somebody who's going to worship me like a god and be eternally grateful to me. How many scenes, how many amorous episodes he had imagined on this seductive and playful theme. When his work was over, and behold, the dream of so many years was all but realized. The beauty and education of Avdotia Romanovna had impressed him. Her helpless position had been a great allurement. In her he had found even more than he dreamed of. Here was a girl of pride, character, virtue, of education, and breeding superior to his own. He felt that. And this creature would be slavishly grateful to him all her life for his heroic condescension, and would humble herself in the dust before him, and he would have absolute, unbounded power over her. Ain't that romantic? That's the character that I'm talking about here with the last man, or last man, okay? It's a character who, first off, lives in his own fantasy world, and dreams up these fantasies, not just of fantasy girlfriends, but of fantasy politics, or of fantasy communities. And then he enacts them as a savior, as a deity. I am an expert. Allow me to tell you how you should recycle your garbage. And therefore, he is not really human anymore. He is somebody who wants power, essentially, over everybody else. See, the Enlightenment of the 17th century proposed that rational scientific progress would replace spiritual struggle. Lords of commerce and bureaucracy would unseat the priests and hermits of Christianity. And Lucian is a lord of commerce and proponent of the Enlightenment's progressive attitude to life. He is devoid of real meaning, and therefore, he is an example of the chartered man, or the last man, or the mass man. But for men like Lucian, self-justified in their behavior, even religion becomes part of their commercialized worldview. This vision of spiritually in league with the state was at the essence of the schism in the Orthodox Church. Okay? See, there's this big schism in the Orthodox Church, which, again, I didn't know about. And it was something where one group of people wanted to worship in the older way, and the other wanted to worship in the new way, which was under one of the czars. And the old way people were revolutionaries. They wanted to overthrow the government in order they could worship in the old way. And they therefore they considered the other group was producing nothing but modernity, like thoughtlessness, modernity. And consequently, they caused fractioning, splitting in the church, in the Russian church, and constant warfare between the followers of the old way and followers of the new way. And it was violent, constantly. They had assassination attempts on the czars, and they would put down people that weren't worshiping in the old way, and they would sometimes beat them up or even destroy their shops. It was startling how fractious that thought was. The old way believers were called by the new way believers Raskolniks. schismatics, Raskolniks. So even the name we see here is part of that element. So I move, I think I've got these out of order or something. We move to certain strange, incomplete ideas floating in the air. Okay? That splitting up is an exemplar of an age of demons that Dostoevsky is addressing as well. And this age of demons is one which, as Wilson writes, Dostoevsky was majorly concerned about how this idea could shift and evolve this concept. And after speaking with Marmeladov in the tavern, Raskolnikov is said to have a strange idea emerge in his head, like a baby chick pecking its way out of its egg. The next day he successfully carries out his crime and thus begins the true drama of the novel. The slow revelation, there was no one idea pecking away in Raskolnikov's head, but a confused chorus of ideas is part of the essence of the novel. See, Raskolnikov is driven by a chorus of voices, which we could say is like Legion, because there are many of them that peck away at him. It's like demonic driving him. See, by the mid-20th century, Romano Guardini warns us against a spirit of demonism that was already present in the modern world. So you've got, on the one hand, mass man who doesn't ask any questions. Now, to mass man, you have this series of incomplete ideas, strange incomplete ideas, like demonic ideas that are introduced in the 19th century. Guardini says, demons may take possession of the faculties of man if he does not answer for them with his conscience. Ask the question. We do not use the word demons as it is used in ephemeral journalism. We are using the item or the term in the precise sense given it by revelation. We mean spiritual beings who were created whole and good by God, but who fell away from him by electing for evil and who are bent on befouling his creation. These are demons then, who rule men once he has abdicated his responsibilities. They rule him through his apparently natural but really contradictory instincts, through his apparently logical but in truth easily influenced reason. They rule him through the brutality committed by his helpless selfishness. Yes?
Was the absence of thought and ideas necessary for this movement of incomplete ideas to come in?
That's a great question. Was the absence of thought and inquiry necessary for this movement to come in? I would put it this way. The presence of thought and inquiry, especially thought and inquiry in a Christian context, was a bulwark against this very thing destroying civilization. You and I may think that the destruction of civilization started, I don't know, three years ago. But just to throw it out there. But it's actually been a very, very long road. It's been as early, you could say, as the 1600s, 1700s. I put it anyway. Before that, it's always been this hammering against civilization, against humanity itself. But against that has been this counter response. Sacraments, right? Community, inquiry, education, which have all pushed back against that hammering so that the society doesn't collapse and the individuals don't collapse. Something happened sometime around the late 1600s or 1700s, which we call the Enlightenment because they all became so enlightened. And that seems to have stripped the landscape. And as Thomas More says in the Man for All Seasons, once all the trees are torn down and the devil turns against you, where will you hide in that wasteland? Right? It's kind of like that. So, yes, good question. Good question. I'm here at the certain strange, incomplete ideas floating in the air. Do we need to take a quick break? Because I know the heat's kind of intense in here. We're going to go for one more section here, and then we'll take a break right before the third section and call it quits.
Sure.
Okay. Is that a yes on the break?
Sure.
Sounds good.
Okay. Jennifer Wilson points out to us that there was a rising crime, a tremendous rising crime in St. Petersburg right before the novel was written, which again is part of this almost demonic thing that occurred. And one of my heroes, Fulton Sheen, points out in the 1960s that the demonic in our age is manifest in three ways. He first off says that the demonic is a diabolic, comes from diabolane in Greek. Okay, diabolic comes from diabolane. Diabolane, which is tearing apart or rending asunder. And he says that anything that breaks pattern, that destroys unity, that corrupts gestalt, produces discord, is the diabolic. anything that produces discord is the diabolic. There has been a great increase of the diabolic in our age, says Fulton Sheen. In our age, he means the 19th and 20th century. Okay. The three elements of the demonic, according to Fulton Sheen, are love of nudity and nakedness, violence, and division. Okay? Love of nudity and nakedness, violence, and division. So I'm going to take them on briefly, one at a time, just to show how these all show up in this lovely little text. Because Dostoevsky was already seeing exactly this. Oh, there he is. Okay. He seems to have been well aware, Dostoevsky does, of the perverseness of our era. A perversion he embodies in the person of this guy here, Fyodor Dostoevsky. He's smooth, seasoned, well-to-do. He's a sensualist who attempts to seduce Raskolnikov's sister, among his other female conquests. He eventually holds over the head of the protagonist knowledge that Raskolnikov is the murderer. Rodion must either render up his sister to Svidrigailov or suffer the punishment for the crime he has committed. It's a pretty hard place to be in. Svidrigailov has a dream, however, just before Rodion is going to go to the authorities. And the dream kind of embodies his descent into hell, if you will. Right? Keeping in mind that this guy, it's not like he's evil, it's sort of like, yeah, evil. He's a handsome, seasoned guy, wealthy guy. But he is a sensualist. He loves nudity, nakedness, seducing young women. And he has this dream. And I have it in your packets here, but I want to quote as much of it as I can here, so bear with me. Svidrigailov walked for some time through a long, narrow corridor without finding anyone and was just going to call out when suddenly in a dark corner between an old cupboard and the door, he caught sight of a strange object which seemed to be alive. He bent down with the candle and saw a little girl, not more than 5 years old, shivering, crying, with her clothes as wet as a soaking house flannel. She did not seem afraid of Svidrigailov, but looked at him with blank amazement out of her big black eyes. Now and then she sobbed as children do when they have been crying a long time, but are beginning to be comforted. The child's face was pale and tired. She was numb with cold. How can she have come here? She must have hidden here and not slept all night. He began questioning her. The child suddenly became animated, chattered away in her baby language, something about Mammy, and that Mammy would beat her, and about some cup that she had broken. The child chattered all without stopping. He could only guess from what she said that she was a neglected child whose mother had probably a drunken cook in the service of the hotel, whipped and frightened her. The child had broken a cup of her mother's and was so frightened that she had run away the evening before, had hidden for a long while somewhere outside in the rain, and at last had made her way in here, hidden behind the cupboard and spent the night there, crying and trembling from the damp, the darkness, and the fear that she would be badly beaten for it. He took her in his arms, went back to his room, sat her on the bed, and began undressing her. The torn shoes which she had on her stockingless feet were as wet as if they'd been standing in a puddle all night. When he had undressed her, he put her on the bed, covered her up, and wrapped her in the blanket from her head downwards, and she fell asleep at once. Then he sank into dreary musing again. I'm going to pause just a minute, because this is a dream, right? But it's a dream really eerily similar to what Luzhin is thinking about with Dunya, okay? Really similar. Luzhin is thinking, I'm going to raise Dunya up from ignominy to greatness. I'm going to be her lord. She's crying, she's shivering, she's helpless, and she needs help, and I'm going to be the lord over her. In the dream, that's exactly what's happening. Svidrigailov sees this little girl, and she's shivering, crying, and helpless, and he brings her back home and puts her to bed. And there's nothing utterly perverse here. It's just this is the dream he's having of helping out someone who's helpless, who needs his aid. But then in the middle of the dream, he has this statement. What folly to trouble myself, he decided, suddenly with an oppressive feeling of annoyance. What idiocy. In vexation, he took up the candle to go and look for the ragged attendant again and make haste to go away. Damn the child, he thought, as he opened the door. And he turned again to see whether the child was asleep. Okay. Part 2 of the dream, right? That was stupid. I shouldn't have bothered. Why do I bother? What's the point of this? That's modern man. That's last man. That's mass man. Why am I bothering? What's the point of any of this? Whatever. Like the woman just killed herself. Big deal. And so Svidrigailov is having the same reaction that we see in the characters like Luzhin and Raskolnikov early on. And here's where things turn very dark in the dream. You know, those dreams was like cute and all that, it's like deer jumping everywhere, and suddenly like the deer start eating each other. Maybe you haven't had those dreams, but this is that kind of dream, okay? Because this is going to get really dark very, very quickly, and it all hinges on that word where he says, "Damn the child." Okay? Damn the child. The child was sleeping soundly. She got up warm. She had got warm under the blanket, and her pale cheeks were flushed. But strange to say, the flush seemed brighter, coarser than the rosy cheeks of childhood. It's a flush of fever, thought Svidrigaïlov. It's like the flush from drinking, as though she had been given a full glass to drink. Her crimson lips were hot and glowing, but what was this? He suddenly fancied that her long black eyelashes were quivering, as though the lids were opening, and a sly, crafty eye peeped out with an unchildlike wink, as though the little girl was not asleep but pretending. Yes, so her lips parted in a smile. The corners of her mouth quivered, as though she were trying to control them, but now she quite gave up all effort. Now it was a grin, a broad grin. There's something shameless, provocative in that quite unchildish face. It was depravity. It was the face of a harlot, the shameless face of a French harlot. Now both eyes opened wide, they turned a glowing, shameless glance upon him. They laughed, invited him. There's something infinitely hideous and shocking in that laugh, and those eyes, and such nastiness in the face of a child. What? At 5 years old? Svidrigaïlov muttered in genuine horror. What does it mean? And now she turned to him, her little face all aglow, holding out her arms. Accursed child! Svidrigaïlov cried, raising his hand to strike her. But at that moment he woke up. He's in the same bed, still wrapped in the blanket, candle not been lighted, and daylight streaming in the windows. I've had a nightmare all night. And he got up angrily, feeling utterly shattered. His bones ached. You're Sigmund Freud and you're analyzing this dream, what do you say? Wow. But it really is testimony to that whole thing we're experiencing even now, folks. You know, we probably have seen elements of this depravity going on in various sources and institutions that we thought before sacrosanct are now openly trying to do things that are highly objectionable. That's what he's embodying here in 1866. This same love of nudity and corruption of the young and corruption of other human beings. And Svidrigaïlov, who himself is complicit in that corruption, wakes up from it and it's like, oh, that was a heck of a dream. All right, on with life. He doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't change his nature at all. He doesn't do anything about the fact that he's been hit over the head. You know, in the ancient world, dreams came directly from God. If you talk to a Muslim right now, the Muslim will say your dreams are the most important connection you have to Allah. You know, your connection to God is frequently through dreams. So here's Svidrigaïlov getting a message from God. Change your ways. Do something different. Don't be a sensualist anymore. Don't be possessed by a demon. But that's not the way it works. Because what does Svidrigaïlov do? He goes out and he puts a bullet in his head. Okay. Yes?
I just have a comment. As you were reading and I was following along, I thought, I don't think that this would ever have been written by a woman.
Really?
I mean, isn't pornography mostly something that men are interested in? I don't think that women spend much time.
My understanding is that it is epidemic among men. Yes.
But with women?
With women, not so much.
With women, it's also a problem.
It's bad, but it's not as bad. And you're right on that score. You're right on that score. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's significant, you know, in much of our modern scholarship, we want to say, well, let's just change the characters from male to female or whatever, you know, that flip of Captain America or whatever it is. And really, I think it's important that Svidrigaïlov is a man that is experiencing this thing. Dostoevsky has female characters who experience other things, right, that are equally horrible or difficult. But it's significant that he is saying a man has this dream and lives in a fantasy world much like the last man does or the masked man does. I'd be hard pressed to say that it's distinctly a male thing to live in a fantasy world and then become a monster on the earth, because I think that women can do it too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is important that Dostoevsky has this character, a man, having that experience. Yeah. If for nothing else, than that he was writing in a world where men had the power.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Right, so he goes out and kills himself afterwards. So that's the end of that element of the mind. And although it frees Raskolnikov from having to turn himself in, it exhibits a hollowness of spirit. A hollowness of spirit that the modern era is rife with. And a hollowness of spirit that drives last man to seek comfort in sensuality, only to find their despair and empty corruption of the most innocent. I read a study just today, as a matter of fact, not Harvard study, so you got to take it with a grain of salt, but it was a study that studied numerous people that have been divorced and said, why is divorce so rampant? Okay, that's not a comment on divorce necessarily, but the study proved that the majority of people divorce, not for financial, not for religious differences, but the majority of divorces occurred in families where men were not the chief breadwinners. And I thought that's a very striking study. We've had this whole thing where men are attempting to stay home and take care of the kids, and women go out and earn money, which we do out of necessity, certainly. The problem that they don't address in that is that when a man's at home alone, he's done the dishes, he's done the laundry, kids are all out playing, so he's got a lot of free time on his hands when he can get his hands on a lot of free time. If you follow my drift, okay? And that is killer to the whole relationship, because he ends up, or can end up, living in a fantasy world much more easily. And I do know from other things I've read, the biggest killer of any relationship between men and women is pornography. That is the number one killer of relationships today, is that living in the fantasy world. So this element of the demonic, which is the nudity bit, the pornographic, living in the fantasy world, has a tendency to destroy real friendships, real relationships, and even relationships to yourself, like Zidrogайлov, you'll find put a bullet in that. So, number 2, violence. He embodies violence in another dream, early in the book. Yes. Yes. I chose it not because of that, but because of the way he's looking at the time.
Oh, it's wonderful, wonderful.
Kate, don't ignore the fact that it's.
Who is that?
Mussorgsky, it's a great Russian composer.
Beautiful painting of him, but it was a perfect painting, I thought, for the character that I'm going to talk about here, Nikolka. Okay, Nikolka. That's how I envisioned Nikolka. In this dream, early in the novel, Dostoevsky has his character Raskolnikov dream about a helpless mare who's beaten to death by a group of men. Okay? And it's horrible. It's an absolutely horrible dream. Okay? But it is a perfect exemplar of what Dostoevsky is thinking about, which is one of the elements of the demonic in our age. The penchant for violence, unbridled violence. Pardon me, that was not. He didn't mean that to be. It was. So here's the passage. This is from part 1, chapter 5. They all clambered into Mikolka's cart, laughing and making jokes. 6 men got in, and there was still room for more. They hauled in a fat, rosy-cheeked woman. She was dressed in red cotton and a pointed, beaded headdress and thick leather shoes. She was cracking nuts and laughing. The crowd round them was laughing too, and indeed, how could they help laughing? That wretched nag was to drag all the cartload of them up at a gallop. 2 young fellows in the cart were just getting whips ready to help Nikolka. With a cry of now, the mare tugged with all her might, but far from galloping, could scarcely move forward. She struggled with her legs, gasping and shrinking from the blows of the 3 whips, which were showered upon her like hail. The laughter in the cart and the crowds were doubled, but Nikolka flew into a rage and furiously thrashed the mare, as though he supposed she really could gallop. "Let me get in too, mates," shouted the young man in the crowd. His appetite was aroused. "Get in! I'll get in," said Nikolka. "She'll draw you all. I'll beat her to death." And he thrashed and thrashed at the mare, beside himself with fury. "Father, father," Raskolnikov cried. "Father, what are they doing, father? They're beating the poor horse." Come along, says father. "They're drunken and foolish. They're in fun. Come away, don't look." And he tried to draw him away, but he tore himself away from his hand, and beside himself with horror ran to the horse. The poor beast was in a bad way. She was gasping, standing still, then tugging again, almost falling. "Beat her to death," cried Nikolka. "It's come to that. I'll do it for her." "What are you about? You're a Christian, you devil," shouted an old man in the crowd. Did anyone ever see the like? A wretched nag like that pulling such a cartload, said another. You'll kill her, shouted the third. Don't meddle, it's my property. I'll do what I choose. Get in, more of you, get in, all of you. I'll have her go at a gallop. And all at once, laughter broke into a roar and covered everything. The mare, roused by the shower of blows, began feebly kicking. Even the old man could not help smiling. Think of a wretched little beast like that trying to kick. Two lads in the crowd snatched up whips and ran to the mare to beat her about the ribs. One ran each side. Hit her in the face, in the eyes, cried Makoka. Give us a song, mates, shouted someone in the cart, and everyone in the cart joined in a riotous song, jingling the tambourine and whistling. The woman went on cracking nuts and laughing. He ran beside the mare, ran in front of her, saw her being whipped across the eyes, right in the eyes. He was crying, he felt choking, his tears were streaming. One of the men gave him a cut with a whip across the face. He did not feel it. Wringing his hands and screaming, he rushed up to the gray-headed old man with the gray beard who was shaking his head in disapproval. One woman seized him by the hand and would have taken him away, but he tore himself from her and ran back to the mare. She was almost at the last gasp, but began kicking once more. I'll teach you to kick, Makoka shouted ferociously. He threw down the whip, bent forward, and picked up from the bottom of the cart a long, thick shaft. He took hold of one end with both hands, and with an effort brandished it over the mare. He'll crush her, was shouted out. He'll kill her. It's my property, shouted Makoka. And he brought the shaft down with a swinging blow, and there was a sound of a heavy thud. Thrash her, why do you stop? Shouted voices in the crowd. And Makoka swung the shaft a second time, and it fell a second time on the spine of the luckless mare. She sank back on her haunches, lurched forward and tugged forward with all her force. Tugged first on one side and then on the other, trying to move the cart, but the 6 whips were attacking her in all directions. The shaft was raised again and fell upon her a third time, then a fourth, with heavy measured blows. Makoka was in a fury that he could not kill her at one blow. She's a tough one, shouted from the crowd. She'll fall in a minute, mates. There'll soon be an end of her, said an admiring spectator in the crowd. Fetch an axe to her. Finish her off, shouted a third. I'll show you. Stand off, Makoka screamed frantically. He threw down the shaft, stooped down in the cart, and picked up an iron crowbar. Look out, he shouted. With all his might, he dealt a stunning blow at the poor mare. The blow fell. The mare staggered, sank back, tried to pull. The bar fell again with a swinging blow on her back, and she fell on the ground like a log. That's a tremendous dream, okay? And that's at the beginning of the novel, before the murder. And it embodies this sense of unbridled violence. Not just violence against other human beings, but violence against the entire world. And if there's one achievement that we have definitely achieved in the 19th and 20th century, is that we are the centuries of the greatest carnage in human history. For our team. It's tremendous when you think about that Fulton is saying, this is an element of the demonic. Violence that's unchecked. Crowd violence, right? Violence by one person thinking that another person or horse is his property, that the natural world is his property. But again, when you lose the sight that the world is created in the image and likeness of God, it's a good thing, and you don't ask any more questions, the world is nothing but hateful matter, as Alan Watts points out. And it needs to be controlled, chartered, or demolished. One more. In this one, I talk about the schismatics. Namely, that the schismatics and the Raskolnikov's name attached to it are a major image in the work. The image of Diablo lying tearing apart, because the schismatics represented not just the schism in the church, but the violence that emerged therein, the revolutionary spirit. The schismatics, as a matter of fact, it turns out, were involved in the Russian Revolution of the early 1900s. Okay? So the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks both conspired together to overthrow the Tsar. And afterwards, the Bolsheviks, the Reds, fought against the Mensheviks, the moderates, and they defeated them, and they established the Soviet Union in Russia. But the old believers were part of that movement. They were part of the Menshevik movement. So they were highly revolutionary characters. And it turns out that they owned a great deal of the businesses in Russia. So they are an example of commerce and of the modern way of thinking, and they were examples of the whole splitting apart that occurs in the modern world. The head of the Russian Orthodox Old Believer Church, Metropolitan Cornelius, reflecting on the murder of Tsar Nicholas II in 1970, stated that the murder of the entire royal family, Nicholas, is a tragedy. Should not have taken place. Alexander Solzhenitsyn very wisely said about this, the 17th century spawned 1917. Who ruined the church and beat the priests? Russian people themselves. Not the French, not the Germans, not the British, but the Russians, who had lost the foundations of their faith after the church schism. It was then that the destruction of the foundation of the faith began. Russia turned to the west, the church lost its primacy, an official began to rule the church instead of the patriarch. And as a result, godless people came to power, killed the Tsar, and destroyed everything. So even the head of the Orthodox Old Believer Church, Metropolitan Cornelius, recognizes that how this happened, this whole Russian Revolution thing, happened because of this splitting, this schism, that then allowed ideas to flood in because people lost sight of God in Russia. So he's recognizing the same thing Dostoevsky's recognizing in his novel. Godless people, as he says, reveal the meaninglessness of a dull spiritual life which looks to revolution and violence as a solution to the problem, to get out of their misery once and for all.
And I turn to this character, who is, the picture is, of Raskolnikov's dream of a split world. Okay? This is a split personality.
Raskolnikov has a dream at the very end of the work, which is the last major dream in the work. You know, you've got the horse dream, you've got the city battle dream, you've got this dream. And this is the last of the three elements of the demonic, which are the funky ideas that come in. So I'm going to read this and then we'll take a break so we can all get some air. Raskolnikov dreamt that the whole world was condemned to a terrible new strange plague that had come to Europe from the depths of Asia. Laugh about it. It's 1866, come on.
It is.
All were to be destroyed except a very few chosen. Some new sorts of microbes were attacking the bodies of men, but these microbes were endowed with intelligence and will. Men attacked by them became at once mad and furious. But never had men considered themselves so intellectual and so completely in possession of the truth as these sufferers. Never had they considered their decisions, their scientific conclusions, their moral convictions so infallible. Whole villages, whole towns and peoples went mad from the infection. All were excited and did not understand one another. Each thought that he alone had the truth, and was wretched looking at the others, beat himself on the breast, and wept and wrung his hands. They did not know how to judge, could not agree what to consider evil and what good. They did not know whom to blame, whom to justify. Men killed each other in a sort of senseless spite. They gathered together in armies against one another, but even on the march, the armies would begin attacking each other. The ranks would be broken, and the soldiers would fall on each other, stabbing and cutting, biting and devouring each other. The alarm bell was ringing all day long in the towns. Men rushed together, but why they were summoned and who was summoning them, no one knew. The most ordinary trades were abandoned because everyone proposed his own ideas, his own improvements. They could not agree. The land, too, was abandoned. Men met in groups, agreed on something, swore to keep together, but at once began on something quite different from what they had proposed. They accused one another, fought and killed each other. There were conflagrations and famine. All men and all things were involved in destruction. The plague spread and moved further and further. Only a few men could be saved in the whole world. They were pure chosen people, destined to found a new race, a new life, to renew and purify the earth. But no one had seen these men. No one had heard their words and their voices. That's the dream. Really prophetic, I think. I mean, it's tremendous what he's writing. Because, 1866, it's almost like all that people splitting apart and having, I define this, but I define that, I define my own truth. I identify as an Apache attack helicopter, I'm a little jelly donut. I am a dog, I identify this way, I identify that way. And this like splitting of the light if you will, into different rainbows. It's almost like what he's describing. I'm remembering Tolkien when Gandalf speaks to Saruman. You remember what Gandalf says to Saruman of many colors? Do you remember that at all, Tolkien fans? He says how unwise it is to split the light seeking truth, right? It's a similar thing. That's kind of what he's describing here. This intense pride that causes this fractioning between people. It's truly amazing to me. And whatever we feel about the events of the last 2 years, it is, to me, it is terrifying, terrifying. Not just to see the fractioning between even family members on issues, but now to see the effects of what we thought were going to be great strides forward in science, causing athletes to fall down on the field dead. That's terrifying. It's very much what he's describing here in 1866. I find it remarkable how he was able to see so far forward. So we live, I think, in an age of Raskolniki. We ourselves are subject to possibly becoming Raskolniks, an age of devils. That's Dostoevsky's part of his message. That's the crime part. How do we get out of that? How do we get out of the misery once and for all? And we'll look at that when we come back from a break. Let's take a break and get some air. To get out of our misery once and for all. And in my search for Russian paintings, this was a great miserable guy picture. So, those are miserable guy. Modernity proposes that knowing the root of the problem might offer the solution to the problem. And that's particularly a Sigmund Freud thing. Sigmund Freud's writing in the early part of the 20th century. If we know how the watch works and what broke the watch, we might be able to fix the watch. If we know what the root cause of humanity's psychosis is, we can cure the psychosis. So Sigmund Freud, for instance, he posited that all our pathologies emerge from some cause or trigger in our childhood. Finding the trigger could lead to therapeutic healing, and thus psychoanalysis became the main bulwark of psychotherapy, which is healing of the soul. Now that's a very, very rudimentary synopsis of Freud's thought. And if you haven't looked at Freud, I highly encourage you to do so. He's a fascinating thinker. I think wrong in a lot of ways, but tremendous in other ways. So that's the synopsis of what he was suggesting. That our finding of the trigger can solve the problem. Finding the cause, the theory goes, will lead to a solution and eventual control of all things. Control of all things. But Dostoevsky, our man here, does not seem to be as concerned with motive for action, good or bad. Or perhaps more accurately, he seems to suggest that the solution to the problem doesn't lie in finding the cause. Does the solution to the problem, for instance, of flight lie in finding the cause of the bird? Does the solution to the problem of tsunamis and tornadoes lie in finding the cause of natural disaster? The modern era seems particularly keen on the idea of controlling and fixing human nature by discovering the root cause of things. You find the motive, and therefore you find the cure. And if you as a side note, if you've seen certain things like, for instance, that Boxing Day tsunami that was back in the early 2000s, a movie thereof called The Impossible, it's like, okay, we understand that it was a shelf that fell into the ocean that caused this huge wave, but that really didn't help anybody in those bungalows survive or deal with the aftermath. That was a terrible, terrible experience. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a wow, stunning movie called The Impossible. It stars young Spider-Man as well as Obi-Wan Kenobi and an actress. And even they can't get out of it. So, to borrow again from Wilson's article, she says, one distinctive feature of Crime and Punishment is that its real plot centers on the search not for the killer, but for a motive. Indeed, with Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky rewrote a basic facet of the detective story by eliminating the question of who committed the crime and focusing instead on the matter of why he committed the crime. As the distinguished Dostoevsky biographer Joseph Frank put it, Crime and Punishment is focused on the solution of an enigma, the mystery of Raskolnikov's motivation. Even Porfiry Petrovich, the magistrate investigating the crime, largely functions as a conduit for Raskolnikov's own desire to confess. So that begs the question, in this idea of how to get out of our misery, why does Raskolnikov kill the pawnbroker? Why does he do so? Is it, for instance, an attempt to prove the Nietzschean ubermensch in himself? Is it an attempt to strike down a wicked, cruel old lady or strike a blow against all she represents? Is it an attempt to disrupt the sensibility of others and put a finger in the eye of the last man, illusion? Is it an attempt to rid himself of the devils in his own head? I mean, he's contemplating the thing even before the novel begins, which is particularly strange. The motive for his crime remains throughout the novel unclear. Even at the beginning of the novel, perhaps before the novel begins, he's contemplating this, and perhaps it's merely a madness brought on by poverty, filth, and starvation. Perhaps it's some psychosis brought on by devils. Perhaps it's a lack of the right medication and holistic treatments of regular colonics, coupled with psychotherapy and sensitivity training. Hard to say. One way or the other, we never really get in the novel why he kills the old lady and her sister. Okay, sorry.
Well, we don't, but, well, he in a sense, he justifies himself, though, doesn't he? He talks about doing great things and using this money from this useless old woman who's exploitative and greedy and is abusive towards her younger sister.
Indeed.
So there is a sort of a justification in his own eyes, although it's very vague, because what does he do with the money? He puts it under a rock somewhere, and you don't see that. It's been many years since I read the novel, but you don't hear much about that money.
No, hardly at all.
No.
And you bring up a very, very, very good point, Doctor. I mean, he justifies his killing as being ridding the world of a very bad person, and of using the money to help his sister, and of proving that he was capable of great things like Napoleon. The problem is that he's lying to himself. And we get that very strong impression that everything he says as a reason for why he does it is an outright lie or justification for why he did it. At one point he even says, all those things I just said, they weren't true. That's not why I did it. You know, he says to Sonia, I did it for this reason. Actually, I didn't do it for that reason. I did it for this reason. Actually, that's not true. I didn't do it for that reason either. I did it for that. No, he doesn't actually have a reason. That's what's really intriguing about it, is that all the reasons that he comes up with, or the reasons other people come up with, are all justifications, but they don't get at the heart of why he actually does the thing. And really, this is, I think, very unique in, if we look at this as a murder mystery, it's very unique in murder mysteries, because most murder mysteries are, this person has this thing going on and that causes the murder. You know, Dorothy Sayers, for instance, great novelist. In all of her works, the killer has some pathology or some psychosis or some messed up thing that causes them to do what they do. Okay, it's very clear why they do what they do. In Agatha Christie, similar thing. The killers always have some reason or some purpose. Right? Here we don't get that really. And that's what's really startling about this novel, is even when he says, I tried to do great things, he later recants that and says the exact opposite. And I'm going to read you, I had it handy right here, so you can just play right into my hands. He says to Sonia in part 5, chapter 4, after telling her I did it for this reason, no, not really, this reason, that, it goes through like 4 reasons. It wasn't to help my mother I did the murder. That's nonsense. I didn't do the murder to gain wealth and power and to become a benefactor of mankind. Nonsense. I simply did it. I did the murder for myself alone. Whether I became a benefactor to others or spent my life like a spider catching men in my web and sucking the life out of men, I couldn't have cared at that moment. It was not the money I wanted, Sonia, when I did it. Not so much the money I wanted, but something else. I knew it all now. I know it all now. Understand me. Perhaps I should never have committed a murder again. I wanted to find out something else. It was something else led me on. I wanted to find out then and quickly whether I was a louse like everybody else, or a man, whether I could step over barriers or not, whether I dare stoop to pick up or not, whether I'm a trembling creature, or whether I have a right. So he says all those reasons, that's all poppycock. That's not true. I did this because I had to prove something. To prove that I was not a last man, if you will. I'm not that sharper man that we were talking about with Blake. I had the right to be able to do this. And she says, the right to kill? Are you insane? Right? she directly contradicts him and says that that's not an excuse. You better come up with something better, buddy, because that's not good enough. Right? Later on, to his own sister, he says something similar. This is after his sister says, I'm glad that you've recognized the crime that you did and you're turning yourself in. And he says to her in part 6, chapter 7, he says, crime? Crime, he cried in sudden fury. That I killed a vile, noxious insect, an old pawnbroker woman of no use to anyone? Killing her was atonement for 40 sins. She was sucking the life out of poor people. Was that a crime? I'm not thinking of it, and I'm not thinking of expiating it, or why are you all rubbing it in on all sides? A crime, a crime. Only now I see clearly the imbecility of my cowardice. Now that I've decided to face this superfluous disgrace, it's simply because I'm contemptible, and have nothing in me that I've decided to, perhaps too for my advantage, as that Porphyry suggested. So you get a sense here that Raskolnikov himself doesn't know why he did it. And that much of what he says as this is the reason I did it is actually him trying to fish for reasons, something's it's like there's this nebulous reason to cause murder, to cause violence to other people. And Dostoevsky, straightened up the speaker, because we always have to separate the writer from the speaker in a novel, right? So the speaker in the novel, Dostoevsky's voice, never says this is why he did it. So even the speaker, who's a fairly omniscient speaker, never has a reason for why this occurs. And he goes on to say about this. Blood has been shed by all men, which flows and has always flowed in streams, which is spilt like champagne, and for which men are crowned in the capital and are called afterwards benefactors of mankind. Look into it more carefully and understand it. I, too, wanted to do good to men, and would have done hundreds, thousands of good deeds to make up for that one piece of stupidity. Not stupidity, even simply clumsiness, but the idea was by no means so stupid as it seems now that it has failed. Everything seems stupid when it fails. By that stupidity, I only wanted to put myself into an independent position to take the first step to obtain means, and then everything would have been smoothed over by benefits immeasurable in comparison. But I couldn't carry out even the first step because I'm contemptible. That's what's the matter. And I won't look at it as you do. If I had succeeded, I should have been crowned with glory, but now I'm trapped. See, here's the amazing thing about this novel. Dostoevsky, as I quoted from Wilson, is not so concerned with the motive for the killing. He's much more concerned with what does this type of mind look like? What does this type of soul look like? And so what we see here is not, oh, that's the reason. Well, that's the reason. You see, to quote Indiana Jones, we're digging in the wrong place when we do that. Okay? We are looking for the motive. What we're not looking at is this is a guy who's suffering terribly still. See, for all of this novel, he's suffering. And if we miss that point, we really haven't read to the very end of the novel, which is okay because most of us know. But the novel, he never stops that suffering. He is always suffering, not just for the crime, but for the very fact that he's fractured too. He's broken apart like every other person in the modern world. That's what Dostoevsky wants us to see. He could care less why he did it. He wants to show what this looks like. Even the jury at his trial gets it wrong, right? The jury of these learned men who are trying, they're looking for motive, and they say, to the intense annoyance of those who maintained this opinion, the criminal scarcely attempted to defend himself. To the decisive question as to what motive impelled him to the murder and the robbery, he answered very clearly with the coarsest frankness that the cause was his miserable position, his poverty and helplessness, and his desire to provide for his first steps in life by the help of the 3,000 rubles he reckoned on finding. He had been led to the murder through his shallow and cowardly nature, exasperated moreover by privation and failure. To the question what led him to confess, he answered that it was heartfelt repentance. All this was most coarse. See, even the jury gets it wrong. They're looking for the motive. Oh, the motive of the killer is this, and the motive of the killer is that. And Raskolnikov feeds them what he thinks they want to hear. But all those reasons we see in that text, which is later on, by the way, in this about, it's about here in the text. Okay? All those reasons he's already refuted. I didn't do it for those reasons. But I'm telling the jury I did it for these reasons because that's what they want to hear, these learned men. They're looking for motive. I'll give them motive. And even after being convicted of the murder and exiled to Siberia, he still questions his motives. He says, why does my action strike them as so horrible? He said to himself. Why does the murder strike them as so horrible? I love that. Why does it strike them as so horrible? Is it because it was a crime? It wasn't a crime. My conscience is at rest. Of course, it was a legal crime. Of course, the letter of the law was broken and blood was shed. Don't punish me for the letter of the law. That's enough. Of course, in that case, many of the benefactors of mankind who snatched power for themselves instead of inheriting it ought to have been punished at their first steps. But those men succeeded, and so they were right, and I didn't, and so I had the right to have taken that step. It was only in that he recognized his criminality. Only in the fact that he had been unsuccessful and had confessed it. He suffered, too, from the question, why had he not killed himself? Why had he stood looking at the river and preferred to confess? Was the desire to live so strong, or was it so hard to overcome it? Had not Svidrigailov overcome it, although he was afraid of death? In misery, he asked himself this question and could not understand that at the very time he had been standing looking into the river, he had perhaps been dimly conscious of the fundamental falsity in himself and his convictions. He didn't understand that that consciousness might be the promise of a future crisis, of a new view of life, and of his future resurrection. Now, right there, which is in the epilogue, by the way, the very last epilogue of the book, Dostoevsky's voice begins to give us an answer, which is really, he's such a genius, you know, he just holds you in suspense until the very last, oh, that's what he's getting at. So you got to read the end of the novel, folks, right? He's really saying, up to now we've been looking for motive, because we want to solve it too. If we find the motive, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not, wanting to be a Superman, so therefore I'm safe. That's the trick that Dostoevsky's playing off here. Because all of us, moderns, are seeking to find a solution to the problem too. It's natural in us. It's ingrained in us. And Dostoevsky holds us to the very last to show us that's not what we should be looking for. We should be instead looking at the suffering of the person that's in front of us. And in that moment of suffering, we might have a moment of introspection to say, am I too in need of salvation? Because that's a powerful question that mass man does not want to ask himself. Am I also in need of salvation? Our motives are frequently obscured, conflicted, complex, or inexplicable. And yet modernity, especially modern psychotherapy, continues to seek a definite cause for our behavior, good and bad, to fix broken man, to solve the problem of human existence. As the famous Kierkegaardian slogan states, life is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be experienced. He didn't actually say this, by the way, just as a side note. I was really crushed to find out that he did it. But when you go to look up your sources and they have that wiki quotes, they're like, Soren Kierkegaard said this. You're like, yeah, but where? He never said this. But it's like, I don't know. Winston Churchill said, so whatever. We'll go with it.
Churchill.
So Kierkegaard, we say, said this amazing thing. Life is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be experienced. And I think therein is the crux of what Dostoevsky is doing for us, to us, in this novel. The reality is not to find the solution, to look for why did Raskolnikov kill the old woman, and therefore we can fix it, because, I'm never going to do that. I'm a good guy. Instead, we read the entire work, which is, by the way, a suffering. And I mean that in the best sense, because someone once said that all education is a form of suffering. The suffering of education is important. That's why you can't just read the Cliff Notes. It's because you have to suffer through the work, or the music, or the art, or the science, or whatever it is. You can't just look it up on Wikipedia. And in Greek, there's a phrase that is, what is it? How's it go? It's prasanta pathos, pathaimathos. Okay, prosanta pathos, pathaimathos. The suffering, no, the experience brings about suffering. The suffering brings about wisdom. Okay? The experience brings about suffering. The suffering brings about wisdom. So what Kierkegaard is getting at, what Dostoevsky is getting at, is when you read his work, you are suffering through what Raskolnikov is suffering. And by doing so, you come to a certain level of wisdom, which is necessary as a cure for mass man. That's the secret. The wisdom is the cure for the mass man. But wisdom is only attained by suffering. If you avoid suffering, you don't get wise. You can get smart, but you won't get wise. And there's a big difference between the two. Right? Mengele was very smart. Right? Heinrich Himmler was very smart. Joseph Stalin was very smart. Their wisdom is in question. Whatever the cause might be, human life, suffering under original sin, venial sin, mortal sin, is a bit of a mess. In the back.
I just have a comment. There's a similar theme in the Oresteia trilogy, in Suffering into Truth. Here's the connection.
My other great passion is the classics. So yeah, it's great. There's a great essay by Robert Fagles, I think, on the Oresteia, which if you haven't read yet, I highly encourage you to read it. Robert Fagles, it's right on that line. It's beautiful. Dostoevsky asserts that as we are forgiven by God, even in our confused dullness of the modern age of demons. We are forgiven by God. He has a character, Marmeladov. That was the guy that I showed originally, who, although alcoholic and ultimately doomed to ruin, here he is, proclaims in opposition to this dull spiritual life about a man that there is a greater salvation than the salvation of rational scientific progress. And Marmeladov, in his drunken zeal, has this great speech that he gives about that salvation. He says about God, He will pity us, who has had pity on all men, who has understood all men and all things. He is the one, He too is the judge. He will come in that day and He will ask, where is the daughter who gave herself for her cross, consumptive stepmother, for the little children of another? Where is the daughter who had pity upon the filthy drunkard, her earthly father, undismayed by his beastliness? And He will say, come to me, I have already forgiven thee once. I have forgiven thee once. Thy sins, which are many, are forgiven, for thou hast loved much. And He will forgive my Sonia. He will forgive, I know it. I felt it in my heart when I was with her just now. He will judge and will forgive all, the good and the evil, the wise and the meek. And when He is done with all of them, then He will summon us. You too, come forth, He will say. Come forth, ye drunkards. Come forth, ye weak ones. Come forth, ye children of shame. And we shall all come forth without shame and shall stand before Him. And He will say unto us, you're swine, made in the image of the beast, with this mark. But come ye also. The wise ones and those of understanding will say, O Lord, why dost thou receive these men? And He will say, this is why I receive them, O ye wise. This is why I receive them, O ye of understanding. Not one of them believed himself to be worthy of this. And He will hold out His hands to us, and He shall fall down before Him. We shall fall down before Him, and we shall weep, and we shall understand all things. We shall understand all, and all will be understood. All will understand. Katerina Ivanovna, even, she will understand. Lord, thy kingdom come. Kind of like that Flannery O'Connor story, if you like Flannery O'Connor, right? Where I'm not a warthog from hell, right? And she's spraying the water, the warthogs and her, the pigs, and she sees this vision of all the people going up to heaven, all the crippled and the lame, other races. And last of all, she's going up to heaven too. Kind of like that. Sonia, the daughter of Marmeladov, understands this great mercy of God, this sinful man. In part 4, chapter 4, she stands up to Raskolnikov's hollow unbelief. the meaninglessness he represents. I love this passage, so if I get a little verklempt, forgive me. It's a wonderful passage. Raskolnikov is tempting her and saying, look, all this bad stuff's going on. Why don't you just curse God and get it over with? It's like Job with his friends right here. Katerina Ivanovna's in consumption, rapid consumption. She would die soon, said Raskolnikov after a pause, without answering her question. Oh, no. And Sonia unconsciously clutched both his hands as though imploring that she should not. But it will be better if she does die. No, not better, not at all better. Sonia unconsciously repeated, Spain. And the children? What can you do except take them to live with you? Oh, I don't know, cried Sonia, almost in despair. She put her hands to her head. It was evident that the idea had very often occurred to her before, and he had only roused it again. And what if even now, while Katerina Ivanovna is alive, you get ill and are taken to the hospital? What will happen then? He persisted pitilessly. How can you? That cannot be. And Sonia's face worked with awful terror. God will not let it be, broke at last from her overburdened bosom. She listened, looking imploringly at him, clasping her hands in dumb entreaty as though it all depended upon him. Sonia was more confused than ever, and color rushed into her face again. She said, no, she whispered with painful effort. It will be the same with Polenka, no doubt, Raskolnikov said suddenly. No, it can't be. No, Sonia cried aloud in desperation, as though she had been stabbed. God would not allow anything so awful. Wait till others come to it. No, God will protect her, God. She repeated herself beside herself. But perhaps there is no God at all. Raskolnikov answered with a sort of malignant laugh. Looked at him. Sonia's face suddenly changed. A tremor passed over it. She looked at him with unutterable reproach. Tried to say something, but could not speak, and broke into bitter, bitter sobs, hiding her face in her hands. So you pray to God a great deal, Sonia? He asked her. Sonia did not speak. He stood beside her, waiting for an answer. What should I be without God? She whispered back, forcibly, glancing at him with suddenly flashing eyes and squeezing his hand. Ah, so that is it, he thought. And what does God do for you? He asked, groping her further. Sonia was silent a long while, as though she could not answer. Her weak chest kept heaving with emotion. Be silent, don't ask. You don't deserve. He cried suddenly, looking sternly and wrathfully at him. That's it, he repeated to himself. He does everything. See, the novel is about crime. It's not about crime. It's not even about crime, is it? That is, the multifarious crimes of lust, and pride, and envy, and wrath, and all those others. It's not even about the punishing despair that we're all guilty of. The greatness of the novel is that it gives voice to the meaninglessness of the modern world, the emptiness of mass man existence, the murderous nature of an age of devils, but it also proclaims that God in his mercy plucks us out of the burning of life. When we commit crimes, small or great, it seems as though the hand of God comes down on us in judgmental punishment. But the reality is that our punishment is our wounding of ourselves, and that God in his infinite mercy uses the punishment to effect our redemption. Dostoevsky's novel then operates like a Felix culpa. Great phrase, Felix culpa, comes from the Exultet originally, which I won't sing here. O Felix culpa quae talam ac tantum meruit habere redemptorum. O happy fault that earned for us so great, so glorious a redeemer. The punishment, all that Raskolnikov goes through, all of this, burns from him the numbing tendencies to be a last man, and allows him instead to become the new man in Christ. It's therefore a great gift, Dostoevsky seems to suggest, that there is no easy solution or escape from the problems we've created for ourselves in the modern world. The paradox, he seems to suggest, is that the only escape from misery is to embrace the misery until we recognize it as a gift from God. Ultimately, there's no simple pill. There's no program. There's no therapy that can help us escape from the misery of life, Dostoevsky says. But escape is not the plan. There's a new superior life of joy and freedom and real love that comes after great striving, great suffering, and great punishment. Now, I'm going to end tonight with the last quotation from the book. Rodion did not know that the new life would not be given him for nothing, that he would have to pay dearly for it, that it would cost him great striving, great suffering. That at the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man, the story of his gradual regeneration, of his passing from one world into another, of his initiation into a new, unknown life. That might be the subject of a new story